Hi everybody, it's Annette from The Art of Intuition, and today we're going to be talking about the correlation between control and fear, and what side in the spectrum we will fall on, and how we start clearing a lot of that energy. So control. What is control? Why do we try to control things? Our human tendency is always going to be try to control things, right? One way or the other. Either we're going to be very submissive in that, where we let other people control things and we follow along, or we're going to be aggressive in that, or we're going to be trying to control others, right? Both are sort of, in a way, overstepping our energetic bounds if we're letting someone else do it, meaning because we don't want the accountability of it, we're just kind of following behind what they do. Also, then we can shift the blame on someone else if it doesn't go the way we want it to go. Or we're kind of imposing what we want on other people, right? And we're normally going to go through where there are some times in our human consciousness where you're going to be completely one way or the other way. The way I normally would see it when I was in my human consciousness and when I see other people in it, usually they can flip and flop me one way or the other depending on who they're with, right? And in some ways you're going to be more passive, in some ways you're going to be more aggressive. But control and fighting for control is sort of a lot of the themes going on right now in the collectives. I was called back to watch Game of Thrones, which I watched years ago and hadn't watched it in a while. And I popped it on the other day and I was like, okay, let me look at this again. And a lot of the themes in that are control. Who has control? It talks about hierarchies and why we put certain people on pedestals in the medieval times, which we're going to use time knowing that it's really not a vertical, it's not a horizontal thing, it's more of a vertical thing. So there really isn't any time. Like technically the medieval times are aspects of you playing out right now. But we look at it and we put people on pedestals back then because of certain traits, bloodlines they had or who they were. And we like to think we don't do that today, but we still do the same thing. We still put people on different hierarchies, based on what they have, how we value it as a human consciousness, because technically when you get into higher consciousness, there are no more hierarchies. But for humans, there has to be, in a sense, teachers and students, there has to be some kind of hierarchy, because you don't have the hierarchy when you're dealing with a human consciousness. There's no respect there. So for a while, it has to be there, and then eventually you get to a point in higher consciousness where it completely transcends, and there is no more hierarchy. But we tend to still put people on pedestals today, right? Because they have something we want, something that we think makes them, whether they're famous, they're successful, they've got money, it doesn't matter what it is, but you're going to notice, and you see it a lot in the collectives, that we still do that. Now, do we think it's as, completely insane like Game of Thrones? We wouldn't think that. We would think, oh no, it's not like that at all. It's completely like that. I would say we're probably meaner to people than they were in the medieval times, in a sense. And like I said, remember, all happening at the same time. But because we're not aggressively attacking people that don't share what we feel is, whether they share a bloodline or they don't share our viewpoints, because we're not like attacking them with a mace, we think it's kinder, right? Like, oh, we're not like that at all. I would say we're more on the passive side than the aggressive side, but it's still a form of control. We try to control everyone, and the whole human consciousness, all those realities are built on control. Controlling what people do, controlling what people think, controlling how you feel about something, controlling what's human right, human wrong. Because only your human consciousness is going to label anything right or wrong. Your soul is never going to label anything right or wrong, successful, failure. It's not going to do that. Because to a higher aspect, there is no right or wrong. It's aligned or it's not. It's love or it's not love. It's conscious or it's not conscious. There's no judgment. Right or wrong puts a judgment on it, right? And there's a lot of judgment going on in the collectives today. There was a lot of judgment going on in Game of Thrones. But you can just sort of see how this plays out and what plays out now. And there's really not that much difference. And just because we're not aggressively doing extremely violent things to each other, we kind of try to give ourselves a pass that it's better. But we can also see how we alienate people, how we throw people out of different collectives. Now, there's a part of that where people have to be thrown out of certain collectives. See, people have to be thrown out of the human collective, where you wouldn't want to leave it, a lot of people. So they get thrown out, they get canceled, and they're banished because they're not towing the human consciousness line, whatever that line is today. The tricky part about human consciousness and those collectives is the line changes all the time. The line's always moving, right? So control is a big aspect of us fighting for control when in our human consciousness we don't really have it. Us letting others control us because we fear what happens if we don't. You're always going to be in some level of control because you fear what's next. If you don't fear anything, you're not trying to control anything. They are two sides to the same coin. If you are not fearing something, you're not trying to control something. We try to control something because we don't want to feel the fear. So we try to control it. We don't want to feel the fear of what happens if we don't. We don't want the chips to fall. We don't want to really have to look at what's aligned. Because what's aligned is eventually going to happen. We can fight against it kind of as long as we want to, but what's highest aligned in that moment for you is what's going to transpire. And a lot of times it might not be what you want to transpire. You know, you might want it to be with a different person. You might want it to be in a different place. You might want it to be a different way. And it might not happen that way. Normally it doesn't happen that way. You know, it happens completely backwards and all these other ways and it comes in and happens. It's kind of like you're writing your own fiction story in a sense. It feels so ridiculous how some things start to correlate and how some things start to happen. So look at where you're trying to control something and look at the fear that's based on that. Fear of these people not being in my life if I don't have these things. Fear of having to leave. Fear of not having any money. Fear of not being loved by another person. Not being loved by myself. Not liking myself. Whatever it is. The fear of going internal with myself. The fear of being by myself. Anytime we get into control, we're trying to battle fear. Now, with ascension, you're going to have to feel the fear. That's why a lot of people run from ascension for a long time, because nobody wants to feel the fear. Fear is one thing a human consciousness does not want to have to deal with, because there's so much fear in our bodies. We are riddled with fear. We're riddled with fear on all these things that might happen. That we fear happening, we might not even know why. And one of the biggest fears we have, we fear death, so we try to control that. We try to control when that's going to happen. You know, we listen to people all the time to tell us, oh, you don't need to worry about that, but you worry about that. You don't need to worry about that, but this could be a problem. We don't even know what we think anymore. Look at how much of your consciousness every day is shaped by what other people say and whether you believe that or not. Look at what comes into your field and what it's trying to tell you. Eventually, you'll be able to see through the manipulation of a lot of stuff. You know, I was listening to something and one person talking about a news station. I might have said this story. I don't know. I said it on something. And they were saying, oh, you know, I can't listen anymore because it's all a lie. They don't tell the truth on that station, whatever the truth was, you know, in that moment for that person. And they knew because when they talked about them, they weren't telling the truth of what that person's perspective of what happened. We've talked a lot about how, you know, different realities for people remember things differently. People interpret it differently. People have a different conclusion, you know, in different realities. So truth to one is not truth to another, and your truth is always going to change. But in that moment, he kind of had this epiphany where if the world, they weren't saying what happened with me, the way I saw it, then how do I know this is how these people see it? It starts to kind of pull back the curtain and the veil, in a sense, on everything that's coming your way, everything that you have been shown to believe, everything that the collectives are being shown to believe, and where the control is still so tight. And the tighter it gets, that's normally when it starts to kind of fall apart. And kind of, just to loop back to Game of Thrones, kind of the same thing on Game of Thrones. The tighter they tried to grip stuff, the worse it all got. Because no one likes to be controlled. The tricky thing in the human realities is no one likes to be controlled. If you said you were being controlled, a human would say, no, I'm not. If you're in that consciousness, you go, I'm not being controlled. But they like to have the structure of something. Because in the higher realities, you don't have that structure of something. At least the human realities we know. You know, the higher realities we don't remember fully until we step into them and start remembering them, of how things work here. You know, it's not like how things work somewhere else. You know, it's kind of different. It's a lot different. It's like flip-flopped and backwards. So start really taking a look at where you're trying to control. And that's a lot for a lot of people right now. A lot of the collectives are doing that, you know, and it's also one thing I would say about one more parallel I'm going to make to Game of Thrones. And there was this bigger thing, this bigger thing that could shift the whole planet in a sense, right? Going on in the north, and then everyone's squabbling amongst themselves about who's going to take the throne. But in the end, it's not really going to matter because the whole world could be decimated. But let's fight over the throne, but it's not going to matter in the end. And there's a lot of that goes on because when everyone's fighting with each other, you can't see the bigger things going on. That's another trope of the kind of the human realities and the collectives. If we pit everyone against each other and they won't see what else is going on, which is way worse than what everyone's fighting about, which no one even knows what we're fighting about anymore. Everyone's just fighting about something. And there's a part of that where people stand up for things they don't agree with. It's kind of a conscious act to stand up from an unconscious program of why you're doing it, right? But it's still a step in the right direction. But you do see a lot of people pitted against each other. Fight among yourselves. Don't worry about what else is coming because everyone's too busy fighting amongst themselves. But eventually, you're gonna tear everybody apart. So it is kind of an interesting parallel. And also, when you go back and you watch something when you were in a different consciousness, you go back and look at it again, and it's gonna be a different act. It's always, if you feel prone to go back and look at something, I always would suggest you do it because it's not going to be what you think. It's going to show you a lot of different energy you're trying to bring in. There's a lot of, we all have nobility bloodlines, activations that come in for us. A lot of them come in, some will come in the Egyptian timeline, some will come in and looking back through royalty, and that's kind of a theme now with a lot of the what's going on with some of the royal family too. You're just seeing a lot of that in a lot of different places too. Hierarchy and how that plays in, and who do we put on a pedestal? And a lot of times we put them on a pedestal because they're in control then. So look at who you put in control. Look when you don't want to be. Look when you're trying to be, when maybe it's not. What are you trying to control it for? You'll know if you're trying to control something because it's hard. It's super hard when you're trying to control something. You're disappointed it's not going your way. You manipulate it your way. You're trying to do whatever you can to get it to go your way. And in truth, we learn after trying to do that, because a lot of us will try to do that to kind of fight those programs and then eventually fight through those programs and release those programs and dig through those programs, setting in the fear. Sometimes you're going to know you got to set through the fear. Other times you're going to know, get up and do something else. You don't have to set in it. You can still feel it, but you don't got to set in it. The fear is what you got to get to. That is where you're going to get the most expansion, is when you get through the fear. That is what holds us all and ties us into the human realities, is fear. That's the one blood line, in a sense, DNA, that hooks us up to the most human aspect of the human collectives, if that makes any sense, is fear. Fear of leaving them. Fear of not knowing what comes next. Fear of going against the human collectives and kind of being shunned from the human collectives, because in a way we are. Now, the bright spot about that is then it really has no more control over you, because you don't live in those realities anymore. So it really has no power here. It's kind of like in The Wizard of Oz. I don't remember which witch it was. My sister was a big Wizard of Oz person, and I technically am not. But whatever witch came in, like, you don't have any power here. Be gone with you. Like, you can't do anything, and you can't do anything. So just go. Because once you exit those human realities, there really is no power there. You're now in a higher power. You're your higher power, in a sense. Different aspects of you. Different aspects of you are a higher power. That shit doesn't fly here. And when it tries to, notice the fear it brings up. The fear of leaving, the fear of judgment of someone else, trying to control the way your ascension process is going. I've been very much I've tried to do that one. So that's kind of one I continuously whittle through that program, trying to control it, wanting to be a certain way, wanting certain people to be here that aren't aligned to be here. But we kind of build that up too. They're going to be so great if they were here, but if they're not conscious, they might as well not be here, because that would be miserable. So, okay. Keep practicing the art of intuition.